This hearing of the Subcommittee on Economic Growth, Energy Policy, and Regulatory Affairs will come to order. I want to welcome everybody for joining us today. Without objection, the Chair may declare recesses at any time. I recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. Over the last 3.5 years into the Biden-Harris administration, many Americans are asking themselves, it's a very important question. I remember when I was a kid in the 1980 campaign, challenger Governor Ronald Reagan looked at folks and asked, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And I think every American should ask themselves that question when they go to the polls in the coming month and a half. Vice President Harris struggles to answer this question because she knows in most parts of the country the answer is an emphatic no. As we've discussed in the subcommittee a year ago, Bidenomics has had a devastating effect for families across this country and their ability to plan for the future. Households have watched their paychecks disappear while seeing the cost of goods and services rise. While President Biden claims his economic policies to restoring the American dream, too many find this dream just out of touch. Since the beginning of the Biden-Harris administration, total inflation as measured by the Consumer Price Index has risen 20.2%. Estimates show that Americans must now spend over $11,000 more each year to have the same quality of life that they had in January 2021. Grocery prices for goods such as bread, poultry, and cereal have all increased in price by 20% and eggs nearly 50%. Gasoline used to transport these goods, that's increased by almost 50%, further driving costs up. Housing costs for mortgages and rent have both increased. Average rent prices are now 24% higher. Mortgage rates have doubled, making it nearly impossible for young Americans to afford their first home. Real wages, and this is very important, real wages for workers are also lower since the start of the Biden-Harris administration, further straining the ability to keep pace with rising prices. Businesses are struggling to cope with the $1.7 trillion in new regulatory costs the Biden-Harris administration has imposed on the American economy. This administration has engaged in massive regulatory overreach in an attempt to fundamentally alter or kill almost every energy and manufacturing industry job in that sector. This morning, the committee released a new report entitled Death by 1,000 Regulations, the Biden-Harris administration's campaign to bury America in red tape. I ask unanimous consent to enter that into the record. Without objection, so ordered. This report details the committee's findings on how the Biden-Harris administration's avalanche of costly regulations impact both businesses and consumers. The report also highlights effective legislative solutions this committee has been advancing to provide necessary reforms to the regulatory process. Of course, Biden-Harris regulatory onslaught is not the only way this administration has tried to impose their left-wing agenda on Americans. Last Congress, the administration, with the help from congressional Democrats, spent trillions of taxpayer dollars driving inflation and weakening our economy. The, quote, Inflation Reduction Act, unquote, and the, quote, American Rescue Plan, unquote, did not reduce inflation or rescue Americans. It did the opposite. Yet, Vice President Harris says Bidenomics is working. And both of these massive spending packages were simply slush funds for left-wing causes. The other side of the aisle wants to obscure the truth, claiming that greedflation or corporate greed is the invisible force driving these hardships. They want to ignore how the Biden-Harris administration's massive regulatory overreach and government spending are hurting the American people. They aren't interested in transparency or accountability. So today we have all of Congress. We continue to shine the light on the Biden-Harris administration. We will hold this administration accountable for the $1.7 trillion in new regulatory costs upon the economy at a time when it was needed the very least. We will hold the Biden-Harris administration accountable for the hidden taxes on consumers as businesses navigate these bureaucratic hurdles, raising prices, lowering wages to stay afloat. We will hold the Biden-Harris administration accountable for their destruction of the American dream for so many and really too many Americans. And Americans deserve answers. They're frustrated and believe their government is not listening to them when they sound the alarm on the economy. And you see this in the polls as to who can handle the economy better, and they're not polling well at all. Americans deserve better, and we need to do better if we have any hope in what we all want for ourselves and our children, which is to live the American dream. Our expert panel of witnesses is here to dispel many of the myths spun by the Biden-Harris administration and offer their insights into how we can right the wrongs of the Biden-Harris administration's economic policies. want to thank the witnesses for appearing before the subcommittee to share their insights, and I look forward to this discussion. And on an editor's note, I think it's very interesting that this administration has been known since its inception as the Biden-Harris administration, but now the Vice President wants you to forget about the hyphen and the Harris. I now recognize Ranking Member Stansberry for an opening statement.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you to the chairman. I want to welcome everyone to the Oversight Committee. And if it's not been apparent in the opening remarks, we're 41 days from the presidential election because the Oversight Committee has been using this committee, speaking of slush funds, as a slush fund for Donald Trump campaign. So here we are once again. We had a similar hearing last week in which the committee majority brought in witnesses who are tied to Project 2025 and tied to both the former and what I think Donald Trump would hope would be his future administration to talk about and to platform their extreme agenda that would take away American rights and that will misrepresent what's happening in our economy, what's happened over the last several years, all in the name of impugning the vice president, who of course is on the ballot with Donald Trump. So you're going to hear a lot of things today. Most of them are probably not based in facts, economics, ways in which this country is actually structured. So I want to just take the opportunity to kind of set the record straight from the top. Our colleagues today are going to promote a false narrative that the Biden-Harris administration policies are all about hurting American consumers, that they're driving inflation, that they've destroyed our economy. Of course, Americans are struggling right now. We've just faced a historic pandemic. Many Americans were struggling before the pandemic. We're still recovering from it. But the truth of the matter is that the United States has amongst the lowest inflationary rates of any industrialized country in the world right now, and it is because of the American Recovery Plan, because of the historic legislation that the Biden-Harris administration has put into place and that the previous Congress under Democratic leadership passed, that we were able to stop some of the more devastating impacts of the pandemic and the devastating impacts of the previous administration. So the exact opposite is true. We've seen over the course of the Biden-Harris administration that they inherited an economic mess. It was both the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it was also the impacts of what happened under the previous administration. And if you roll back the tape, of course, you'll see that during the Trump administration, he advocated for the largest tax giveaway in American history to the wealthiest individuals and large corporations, which has helped to drive not only extreme impacts on the U.S. economy, but enrich the wealth of individuals and corporations at the expense of the working people of this country. Under the Trump administration, unemployment skyrocketed to nearly 15%. It was the highest since the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics began collecting data in 1948. The highest. That's outrageous. And then as soon as he took office, President Biden worked with Congress to pass meaningful legislation to get it under control. We passed the American Rescue Plan, which not only helped millions of Americans get through one of the largest economic disturbances in American history, but also through one of the largest pandemics in which the former president was telling people to swallow bleach to deal with COVID-19 and telling them to take horse pills. So if we want to talk about the economy, talk about facts, let's actually talk about facts. I want to just emphasize some of the important pieces of legislation that have helped the United States get inflation and our economy back on track. It wasn't just that Biden-Harris came in under this set of extenuating circumstances. President Biden had a vision of the future of this country. He had a vision for bringing back American jobs to this country and helped to pass the CHIPS and Science Act, which is one of the most important modern manufacturing bills, as well as a national security bill to make sure that we are manufacturing made in America goods here on American soil. That is creating thousands of jobs and helping to bring manufacturing back to our rural communities, including in mine. He passed the bipartisan bipartisan infrastructure bill, which is building water lines and broadband and roads and bridges all across America. And he passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which extended health care to millions of Americans, which states had refused to provide expanded Medicaid to. And so our lowest income individuals across the country are actually having access to health care for the first time. The Inflation Reduction Act was also a historic investment in the future of this country. It's an investment in our economy as we make a transition to an energy economy that is clean and that solves our climate crisis. Right now, we're seeing millions of dollars being pumped into our communities that's revitalizing local jobs, that's bringing home manufacturing, and that's employing thousands of New Mexicans and millions of Americans across the country. Now, the question is, how do we translate these economic gains into the real lived experiences of New Mexicans and Americans across the country? It's easy for politicians to come here and explain to the American people how hard it is to put food on the table and a roof over their head. I grew up in a working family. I grew up in a family that struggled to get by, that struggled to make ends meet. And had it not been during times of crisis when we could depend on resources to help us with housing and to pay for utility bills and to help put food on the table, I wouldn't be sitting here as a congresswoman today. We know that these programs help lift American people out of poverty, and we know that they stimulate the economy. So I'll just say, as we embark on what I'm sure will be an interesting journey into false and fun facts this morning, that the American people are smart. Don't be fooled by what you're hearing here today. This is yet another campaign opportunity that the majority is using to platform and advance Donald Trump's extreme agenda. And I don't think the American people are going to buy it. So thanks. I yield back.
Thank you. This is a platform on truth, and just for the record, I grew up in a middle-class family. We have with us today experts on this panel, and who will bring valuable experience and insight that will be beneficial, I think, to our discussion. First, we have Dr. Paul Winfree, who is President and CEO of the Economic Policy Innovation Center. He previously served as Deputy Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy, Deputy Director of the Domestic Policy Council, and Director of the Budget Policy in the Trump administration. He was also formerly the Distinguished Fellow in Economic Policy and Public Leadership at the Heritage Foundation. Patrice help me out. Onwuka, thank you. Patrice Onwuka serves as the Director of the Center of Economic Opportunity at the Independent Women's Forum. She's worked in policy, advocacy, and communications roles in White House for more than a decade on issues related to the economy, employment, technology, philanthropy, and the criminal justice system. Chuck DeVore serves as the Chief National Initiatives Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and Texans refer to as TPPF. He was also previously a member of the California State Assembly. He also was formerly a Reagan White House appointee in the Pentagon and a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. Thank you for your service, sir. And finally, we have Brendan Duke, who serves as a Senior Director for Economic Policy at the Center of American Progress Action Fund. He is a former Hill staffer, and previously served in the Biden-Harris administration as a Senior Policy Advisor at the White House National Economic Council. I want to thank you all for being here. Pursuant to Committee Rule 9G, the witnesses will please stand and raise their right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may sit down. Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. We appreciate you being here, and thank you for your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses that we have read your written statements, and it will appear in full in the hearing record. Please limit your oral testimony, if you could, to 5 minutes. As a reminder, please press the little button in front of you. You're going to see a green light go on for 4 minutes, and then there's going to be a yellow light for 1 minute, and then the red light when it comes up. If you haven't finished your remarks, if you could kind of wrap them up right there, we would greatly appreciate that. I now recognize Dr. Winfree for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Fallon, Ranking Member Stansbury, and members of the committee. And thank you for your opening statements. There were lots of very important points that were made by both sides. Each year, the White House Council of Economic Advisors submits an economic report of the President. The ERP outlines the administration's key economic goals and strategies to achieve them, serving as a crucial part of the federal budget process. The 2022 ERP, the first under this administration, established the primary goal of, quote, restoring the public sector as a partner in long-run growth. This objective focuses on new ways of integrating the government into the economy based on a concept that federal investment is foundational to economic growth. Based on virtually any metric, the Biden-Harris administration has succeeded in growing the size and scope of the federal government. After the 2020 pandemic surge in federal spending, debt as a percent of the economy briefly declined. But from April 2021 onward, it has consistently grown. Federal hiring has hit all-time highs, and state and local government employment has grown significantly, supported by federal subsidies. Furthermore, new regulations from the administration have added considerable costs to the private sector. As Chairman Fallon noted, $1.7 trillion in regulatory costs and $325 million in paperwork hours. The Biden-Harris administration's economic strategy is founded on the belief that public spending is the engine of job creation, income growth, and wealth. However, this approach has contributed to both rising costs and ineffective government. It has also hindered the broader capacity of economic policy to create an environment that fosters economic opportunity. A more effective approach to economic policy would involve focusing on full employment, low inflation, and sustainable growth. Policymakers should also harness American entrepreneurship to drive innovation, job creation, and wealth generation, ensuring market competition while limiting government regulation to essential safety standards would encourage economic dynamism and reduce costs for consumers. Inflation remains one of the most significant issues facing Americans today. As of July 2024, it takes about $1.20 to purchase what $1 bought in January of 2021. Although some have blamed corporate price gouging, research indicates that tight labor markets and large budget deficits are the primary drivers of inflation. The tight labor market, which saw job vacancies outpacing unemployment, contributed to wage inflation and price increases. Additionally, fewer workers have returned to the workforce following the pandemic, with around 2.9 million fewer people employed today than pre-pandemic trends would suggest. The shortage of workers, particularly among younger cohorts, and particularly among young male cohorts, has lowered productivity, reduced government revenues, and increased the federal deficit. Deficit spending is another major cause of inflation. Since 2020, 76% of new government spending has been financed by debt. 14% has been financed by printing money. Together, tight labor markets and deficit spending can explain about 80% of the increase in core inflation that has occurred since the beginning of 2021. Inflation has been further exacerbated by the Inflation Reduction Act. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the IRA increased spending by $110 billion and the deficit by $60 billion between 2022 and 2026, compounding inflationary pressures that were already in motion. Furthermore, the administration has been hampered by its focus on multiple competing initiatives, which has undermined its effectiveness of its core economic priorities. A prime example of this is the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, a key component of Bidenomics aimed at expanding high-speed internet access. Although almost $43 billion has been allocated to this initiative at the end of 2021, and the money was sent to the states last summer, as of today, no households have been connected due to administrative restrictions and delays, including efforts to regulate internet pricing. At the same time, the Affordable Connectivity Program, which provided subsidies to low-income households for internet access, increased broadband prices for all consumers by subsidizing demand without expanding supply, because BEAD has ultimately failed. On average, ACP increased broadband prices by about 7%. Moving forward, reducing the deficit and deregulation in a way that increases market competition would be more effective at reducing costs for essential goods like housing, food, and health care. Congress will have an opportunity to do this in the new year by dealing with a series of events such as the expiration of the 2017 tax cuts and the reinstatement of the debt limit, as well as many other fiscal inflection points that, regardless of how the election turns out, you will be asked to confront. The budget process and budget reconciliation in particular are tailor-made to provide an opportunity to address the rising cost of living by reducing government spending. With that, I yield back the remainder of my time. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I now recognize Ms. Onwuka for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Fallon, Ranking Member Stansberry, and the committee for inviting me today. My name is Patrice Onwuka, and I'm the director of the Center for Economic Opportunity at Independent Women's Forum. We're committed to increasing the number of women who value free markets and personal liberty. My remarks today will focus on how ill-advised federal policies under the Biden-Harris administration have led to remarkable hardship for American households. We know that prices are up 20%. Heating oil is up 36%. Electricity is up 32%. Natural gas up 25%. Housing costs have accelerated and are the biggest driver of the consumer price index, also the inflation rate. Credit cards and mortgages all cost more each month, and consequently, American households are in a more tenuous financial position than they were before the inflation took off in early 2021. Lagging growth in real wages has eroded Americans' purchasing power. Average households have lost roughly $2,000 of purchasing power since that time. The average middle-class household lost at least $33,000 in real wealth. Personal savings have fallen by nearly $3 trillion, while collective credit card balances are an all-time high of $1.1 trillion. The monthly cost of the median-priced home in the United States is at its highest in more than 30 years. More alarmingly, poor and working-class families are spending disproportionately more of their income on essential items, such as food and energy. Low-income families often face a heat or eat dilemma, an existential choice between paying for utilities or buying food, medicine, and shelter. And low-income Black communities, households, experience the highest rates of energy challenges compared to their other demographic comparts. Households. Regionally, low-income families in the Southeast states are also disproportionately likely to face energy hardships. Take a 44-year-old North Carolina mom who said, "Sometimes I have to choose between whether I'm going to pay the light bill or pay rent and food." Why is that the case in the United States, in a place where we should have so much prosperity? Well, I would argue that federal policy under the Biden administration has undermined domestic energy production and fueled inflation. Inflation and high prices are the consequences of unsustainable federal spending and burdensome regulations, particularly on energy. Economists on the left and the right agree that the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan fueled inflation by injecting the economy with stimulus funding when the economy could not keep pace. It's a myth that inflation is due to Russia invading Ukraine. Inflation had already risen to 7.9% when Putin invaded Ukraine. It's also a myth that supply chain disruptions continue to drive inflation today. We've seen those supply chain disruptions have eased. And thankfully, the overly generous pandemic benefits that were a disincentive for people to return to work have come to an end. Finally, it's a myth that big companies, from energy companies to grocers, are price gouging, causing prices to remain high. The Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco examined industry-level data on price markups of goods and found no evidence of widespread markups on goods across all industries. So legislation and regulatory efforts to attack price gouging are futile at best and will not bring down prices. The Biden-Harris climate agenda has focused on undermining domestic energy production, causing energy costs to rise. Everything grown, manufactured, produced, packaged, and transported depends on energy. And as energy prices rise, we as consumers are forced to pay more for the goods and services we depend on. Yet this administration has canceled pipelines, taken millions of acres offline for drilling, and instituted restrictive new environmental standards that raise the cost of drilling. It has also pursued a carbon-reducing regulatory agenda that forces households to switch to costly appliances. We're paying 34% more for appliances compared to 15 years ago. And by targeting 15 consumer appliances with new energy restrictions standards, everything from stoves to refrigerators and air conditioners, even clothing washers and dishwashers, we're going to see fewer available appliances on the market, fewer options for consumers. The upfront cost of installing these new appliances are cost prohibitive to many households, so they're not even going to enjoy any purported energy savings. And they'll have to compromise on features and performance and results. Let's be realistic here. How can we ask American households to pay an average of $9,000 to retrofit their home with these appliances when they can barely afford heat? I look forward to more discussion about today's topic, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes Mr. DeVore for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Stansbury, I think it's important to note that as the COVID-19 triggered a recession, it was, in fact, a very short and sharp recession due to the fact that it was government-imposed lockdowns that caused the loss in labor. In the period of time from the recession to the inauguration of the Biden-Harris administration, though, 57% of those pandemic jobs that were lost were recovered. It took another 17 months, though, to return to the same level of employment that had been the case just before the onset of COVID. Now, with all that federal money being spent, the question might be, why did it take 17 months? For gosh sakes, that's a long time. One reason is likely the collapse of what has been known as the multiplier effect. That's an economic theory that says that when the federal government spends money or, quote, invests in the economy, that those investments result in a multiple of dollars being returned back to the economy, as might happen with real investments. Unfortunately, as we've now accumulated some $35 trillion in federal debt, the multiplier effect has been declining. During the Great Recession era of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, that would be clear back in 2009, almost halcyon times by comparison to today, the multiplier effect at that time for that government spending was estimated to be about 60 cents on the dollar. In other words, you were 40 cents underwater. The most recent expenditures, for example, with the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, the multiplier effect is likely collapsed to 20 cents on the dollar, meaning a lot of that money is being wasted. And as a result, the investments really function to change the economy. We saw that when President Biden just a couple of weeks ago admitted that the Inflation Reduction Act had little to do with reducing inflation and everything to do with transitioning the economy from hydrocarbons to electricity for the purposes of climate change. Now, I've got perhaps some advanced warning or experience with this because, like Mr. Khanna, I'm originally from California. In fact, I served in the legislature there for 6 years before being termed out, and then, I think wisely, moving to Texas in 2011. While I was a state legislator, I voted no a lot, and I voted no on the very items that, of course, passed the legislature back then and have been kind of mirrored in federal policy since. So it's like a preview of coming attractions, and of course, this is somewhat due to, as we refer to the states sometimes as laboratories of democracy, and for better or for worse, California is often at the very leading edge of developing these new ideas. And we can kind of see from the record how that's affected Californians. So, for example, the U.S. Census Bureau, since 2009, has published the Supplemental Measure of Poverty. It takes into account the cost of living, non-cash benefits, et cetera. California, ever since this new measure was rolled out, has always had the nation's highest poverty rate. The other thing that I think is important to understand is the regulatory burden in California. We passed a measure back when I was in office, one of the things I did vote for, that looked at the regulatory compliance cost in California for California-based regulations. What we found is that in inflation-adjusted terms today, it would be worth more than $200,000 per small business simply to comply with regulations. It's important to note then, though, that at the time, federal regulations were estimated to be, at about $1.1 trillion in compliance costs, meaning that the Biden-Harris regulatory regime more than doubled the amount of regulations that were on the books just before the Great Recession. I think it's also important to understand that energy plays a big role in this. California has seen their energy costs go from the 8th highest in the nation to now the 2nd highest in the nation, only behind Hawaii. And there's reasons for this. It's California's aggressive push for electrifying their economy. It comes at a great cost to California workers and to the very high cost of living in California. And unfortunately, I think that we are going down the same path today. And then lastly, I think it's important to note that some people who look at the Biden-Harris record like to point to total payroll growth since the inauguration. The problem with that is that we're looking at total employment. We're not looking at how much average wages have grown. And if you know anything about how employment has shifted since inauguration, the vast majority of those jobs have gone to foreign-born individuals, many of whom, probably all of whom, majority, pardon me, are here illegally. So people who are benefiting from this are generally not Americans. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. The chair now recognizes Mr. Duke for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Fallon, Ranking Member Stansberry, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Brendan Duke, and I'm Senior Director for Economic Policy at the Center for American Progress Action Fund. I'm honored to testify today on the performance of the economy since 2021, as well as some of the inflationary risks I see on the horizon. Inflation has been a challenge for working families since 2020, but the good news is that the 6-month annualized inflation rate was 2.3% in July, just above the Federal Reserve's target. It is now lower than the 3.1% rate when President Biden took office in January 2021. In fact, the Federal Reserve cut rates just last week because inflationary risks have receded. The U.S. economy has weathered an array of once-in-a-generation challenges, or even once-in-a-generation challenges, such as a pandemic, Russia's war in Ukraine, a semiconductor shortage, and more. The recovery is most apparent in the share of workers with a job, which is essentially at a peacetime high and at its 2000 level after accounting for the aging of the population. The wage of a typical worker grew 25% between the fourth quarter of 2019 to July 2024, while prices rose 22%. Wage growth for lower wage workers has been even faster. There is no dispute that cumulative inflation over the last 4 years has frustrated families, though. An analysis of when, where, and why inflation surged shows that the vast majority of it is the result of supply chain disruptions that came from the unfreezing of the parts of the economy that froze during the pandemic. We have published analyses by the White House Council of Economic Advisors and former Federal Reserve Chair and Bush administration official Ben Bernanke showing this. But perhaps the easiest way to see this is to look at inflation in other advanced economies, which also surged. The U.S.'s fiscal response to COVID was larger than these other countries, but they experienced similar inflation to us. I still have not heard a single explanation for how the U.S. could have avoided these inflationary shocks that hit Germany, the U.K., and other rich countries. Where the U.S. economy does stand apart, though, is growth. The German economy, for example, grew less than 1%, and the UK economy grew less than 2%. Over a period, the US economy grew over 9%. If the supply chain disruptions caused the inflationary surge, it's worth spending some time on when exactly they arose. The 6-month inflation rate was already 2.6% in October 2020, well above the Federal Reserve's target. It exceeded 3% the month Biden took the oath of office, and was almost 4% in March, the month Biden signed the American Rescue Plan. A look at more granular supply chain indicators, like the New York Fed's Global Supply Chain Pressure Index and the number of ships waiting to dock outside the ports of LA and Long Beach, similarly indicate that these disruptions preceded the Biden administration. Policymakers should celebrate the achievement of bringing down inflation back toward the Fed's 2% target without a recession, essentially a soft landing, but unfortunately some are trying to immediately reverse that progress of reducing inflation. Former President Trump has proposed a 10 to 20% tax on every imported good entering the country, and a 60% tax of every imported good from China. I have estimated that this could lead to a $3,900 tax increase for a typical family. My analysis is in line with several other think tanks, including conservative ones, like the Tax Foundation, $6,000, the American Action Forum, $3,900, and the National Taxpayers Union, $2,500. Wall Street analysts, including Goldman Sachs, Bloomberg Economics, the Capital Group, and Moody's, estimate that these import taxes would bring inflation back into the 3 to 4% range. In fact, the 20% import tax would raise gas prices by about 30 cents per gallon by taxing Canadian oil and gas imports. Trump has framed his proposal as a way to counter China's non-market practices, but 60% of the imports it would tax come from 6 U.S. allies and neighbors: Canada, Mexico, the EU, the UK, Japan, and South Korea. The Biden administration's strategy is different. It focuses trade remedy actions on precisely those goods where it is in the national interest to maintain industrial competitiveness, and then to align those actions with significant investment in American manufacturing. Moreover, it views tariffs as just one part of a larger reindustrialization strategy designed to rebuild the country's productive capacity and sustain American competitiveness well into the future. The results of the Biden administration's manufacturing strategy speak for themselves. It helped spur the creation of 700,000 new manufacturing jobs, pushing the total number of manufacturing jobs above pre-pandemic levels, which is especially impressive coming out of a recession. New factory construction has almost doubled after adjusting for inflation. The American economy has weathered a pandemic, global supply shocks from geopolitical events, and more. Americans have come out ahead, and it looks like the economy is headed for a soft landing. Policymakers should seek to build on these successes instead of undermining them. With that, I yield back the balance of my time, and thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I now recognize my good friend from New York, Mr. Langworthy, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Since day one of the Biden-Harris administration, Americans have seen an all-out attack on consumer choice. Whether it be the appliances that we buy or the cars that we drive, the Biden and Harris administration has forgotten about the everyday Americans and instead has catered to a radical left-wing environmental cult by choosing winners and losers in consumer markets. Mr. DeVore, would you agree with this characterization?
Well, certainly Mrs. DeVore would agree with that characterization, given the low quality and the unusual characteristics of some of the low-energy appliances we've been forced to purchase, many of which seem to soon fail and take frequently considerably longer to accomplish their tasks in the name of nominal energy savings. Yes. Yes, sir.
Well, very good. Look no further than the efforts to mandate, as you said, the types of household appliances that everyday Americans can purchase. I think, my family's on our 4th washing machine in about 10 years. We saw attacks on dishwashers, on shower heads, gas stoves, furnaces, and several other appliances necessary for our everyday lives. Mrs. Onwuka, do you believe that these mandates have contributed to the findings of data reported on by the New York Post in July, where 73% of Americans reported that their utility bills strain their finances, and 1 in 10 said that they would borrow money from friends or families to cover costs?
Thank you for your question. I think absolutely there's an increase in utility cost, and obviously if you're able to afford these new energy efficient appliances, maybe that is contributing, but overall their utility bills are up, and so I think we're increasingly seeing a lot of families who are making, as I mentioned, that heat or eat existential choice.
It's a very unfair choice for our hardworking taxpayers. Onto electric vehicles. Now, not only has the Biden and Harris administration catered to the radical environmentalists on appliances, it's also chosen winners and losers in what was once America's most prosperous industry, the auto industry. Despite prices at the pump reaching record new highs and surpassing an average of $3 a gallon anywhere in the country for over 1,000 consecutive days, gas-powered cars remain a more affordable option for most consumers compared to their electric counterparts. Yet the Biden and Harris administration doesn't seem to care about affordability or practicality, for that matter. Unelected bureaucrats in the administration have levied several mandates, like the EPA's tailpipe emission final rule that favors the electric vehicle industry and requires Americans to drive electric vehicles. Mr. DeVore, according to Kelley Blue Book, an average electric vehicle costs nearly $57,000 on average. Do you believe that the average American family can afford this in our current economy?
Well, no, sir, they can't. And imagine how much more it would be once the subsidies were removed, including some of the imputed subsidies, for example, with the CAFE standards that benefit EVs considerably beyond their actual fuel efficiency. If these are accounted for, the federal supports for EVs are currently averaging about almost $50,000 per vehicle. And then there's a further challenge with that. If you look at the Inflation Reduction Act spending, one of the huge areas that was not considered in all of that government spending is the infrastructure requirements to electrify our economy. So, for example, those little cans that are in your neighborhood, the small transformers that feed your neighborhood electricity? Well, those are insufficiently sized if several of your neighbors buy EVs and they come home and plug them in all at once. Those small transformers in your neighborhood are going to be overmatched. They're going to either fail or the circuit breakers will trip. If you then look throughout the economy and look at the large high voltage transformers, by the way, the majority of those are imported, the plurality of which come from the People's Republic of China. You can't even get new major transformers, the high voltage kind, for 36 to 48 months. That's the current backlog to get them. So the challenge, if you look at all of these costs that were not included, we're looking at $2.4 to $4 trillion of additional costs for things like rapid chargers, a charger network on our freeways, and neighborhood infrastructure increases. And, sir, that's not even including efforts to shift home heating from natural gas to electricity.
Well, you are really on the same page as what I'm hearing from my constituents in upstate New York, and we have had significant strain economically, and with a government picking winners and losers and choosing a mass electrification mandate like in my home state of New York, it has put our future in peril, and that's why so many people are choosing to vote with their feet and move to states where they have more personal and economic freedom. But, you know, in terms of a federal administration, you know, we're seeing, you know, what is happening in our dark blue states happening to our whole country. So it's in the American people's hands this November. But I thank you for your testimony. I'm out of time, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Langworthy. The chair now recognizes my friend from New Mexico, Ms. Stansberry. Oh. Up to y'all.
All right. Well, I'm just going to use a few moments here to do a little bit of fact-checking and overviewing of kind of what's going on here today. So, Mr. Winfree, Dr. Winfree, thank you for being here today. I appreciate it. I was really interested to see that you are the author of Chapter 24, Project 2025 on the Federal Reserve. Is that correct?
That's right. There'll be a quiz afterwards.
Well, you know what? So actually, I was reading it while I was sitting here, and there's some really interesting economic theories. So I'm a bit of an economics geek, so I was interested. And one of the sub-chapters in Project 2025, Chapter 24, that you wrote talks about free banking, and it's one of the features. And you alluded to it in your testimony in terms of sort of returning the purse strings back to Congress in terms of the budget process for the federal government. But as I understand this economic theory that you're putting forward around the concept of free banking is to essentially deregulate the money market and interest and to return banking regulation to the banks. Is that correct?
So I don't actually recommend free banking. What I do is I make a series of recommendations for how to rethink monetary policy under the current system where the Federal Reserve controls monetary policy through an independent Fed, which I think is really important.
But is
I
the
then
effect,
go
Mr.
through a
Winfree?
series of other theoretical
But Mr. Winfree, hold on just a second. Let me
Well, hold on.
clarify my
I go through
question.
it.
Let me clarify my
Sure.
question. Do you have a subchapter in your chapter that is titled Free Banking?
And what does it say at the end of the chapter, of the subchapter?
Just answer the question, sir.
It says that...
Yes, the answer is yes,
It says that
correct,
this is a
right?
suboptimal way of conducting monetary policy. I also
Miss
list
Dr.
a series
Winfree,
of
let's
other...
clarify. So Project 2025 is a presidential transition document, correct? It's the intent of this document as it was drafted was to provide a transition document regarding policies that you would hope the next conservative administration would adopt. Is that correct?
It is a...
That's what it's designed
It's
to
a
be.
book that was published by the Heritage Foundation. And when I wrote that chapter, I was employed by the Heritage Foundation. I am no longer employed by Heritage.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, I want to just point out, thank you, that the stated purpose by the Heritage Foundation and the over 100 conservative organizations involved in this document is for it to provide a transition document for the Trump administration. And while I understand that our colleagues have been trying to distance themselves from it, it is the playbook that was put forward by the conservative community for the next administration. And I appreciate your clarifications this morning, but Mr. Chairman, I would like to like to ask for unanimous consent to have Project 2025 admitted into the record for this hearing. It's relevant to Mr. Winfree, Dr. Winfree's testimony.
All 900+ pages?
Yes, sir.
All right. Without objection?
All right.
So ordered.
And I really encourage the American people to crack this book open, and you can Google it and find it and read for yourselves. You can read about free banking, about deregulating the banks, about allowing our banking system and economy to be deregulated so that they can do what they want. And we all know what the outcome of that is. We saw the huge crash that happened in 2008 that devastated our economy, wiped out people's wealth, wiped out their savings, wiped out teachers who had their retirement accounts completely destroyed, people who lost their homes, who ended up homeless as a result of it. And so I appreciate that you're bringing these ideas. I'm all for debate on big ideas, but we already have tried, and Donald Trump has tried some of these policies, and they were devastating for the American economy. I just want that to be clear. Now, I want to clear up a couple of other things. Ms. Onwuka for Economic Opportunity Independent Women's Forum. We had another witness last week from the Independent Women's Forum. It's an organization that's also involved in Project 2025. You guys have a number of contributors, correct?
I can't speak to that, but I do know at least one person who did author a chapter, not me.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. But I do want to clarify that some of the statements that were made this morning about price gouging, and especially around the energy sector, are just unfactual. The American people know they're being price gouged. Go grocery shopping. We see it. We see it every day. In terms of American energy, the facts do not support what was stated here. We have the highest oil and gas production in American history has happened over the last several years. The reason why gas is expensive at the pump is because these oil and gas companies are jacking up the price at the pump in order to make more money. They have record profits. That is what is going on. It has nothing to do with production. So we need to actually be clear. And then, Mr. DeVore, I appreciate that you're a former House rep. That I appreciate anyone who puts their name on the line, but the statement that was made about immigrants who are undocumented taking American jobs under the legislation that we passed is a statement that Donald Trump made at a rally and is just untrue. So I just want to be clear about that. Secondly, the Inflation Reduction Act is the name that was assigned to a bill that President Biden passed by the United States Senate. That's a name that came from the U.S. Senate. So just wanted to do a little fact checking here this morning. I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady's time has expired. You went over a little bit. Ms. Onwuka, do you want to respond? Briefly, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Just to respond to something that you said, Ms. Stansberry, don't take up your qualms with me. Take it up with the Federal Reserve, who put out the information around price gouging, looking at not just at one particular industry, but industries across the board, and found that there was no markup increase, that signals price gouging. So I'm happy to. It's in my submitted testimony. I'm happy to provide you the actual source of that, but you can pursue it for yourself and figure out where we disagree.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just say, I don't have any qualms with our witnesses. I have qualms with the price gouging that's happening at the grocery store, and the American people know what's happening.
I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. Mr. Duke, you said, I just want to make sure I got this right, that when the Biden-Harris administration took office, the inflation rate was at 3.1%. Is that correct?
The 6-month annualized PCE
Yeah,
inflation.
I mean, rough, okay. And then it recently was 2.3%?
That's
I think that's what you said. I was taking
that's
notes when you
right.
were speaking. What was it in 2022?
Higher.
A lot higher, 8%.
Yeah.
40-year high. You didn't mention that part. I just found that was interesting. And then as far as Project 2025 goes, I thought this was also fascinating. We had a hearing in Oversight, and the ranking member mentioned Project 2025 12 times in his 7.5 minutes opening testimony. Then I asked the Democratic witness a series of questions about the Department of Defense and missile defense and China, and he agreed with every single thing that I said, every proposal, and everything came out from the DoD chapter of Project 2025. Hadn't read it until this weekend. Ms. Winfree, were you directed by former President Donald Trump to contribute to or author anything in 2025, Project 2025?
I was not. I haven't spoken to former President Trump since I left the administration.
What that is a document from a think tank, and that's what think tanks do. And the Democrats cannot stop talking about it. There are orders from on high at Project 2025. If you read it, you'll die. Whereas, in like any one of those documents, that's 900 plus pages, which I have not read at all, believe it or not, that there's going to be things you agree with and things you disagree with. That's just the nature of the being. But I find that to be absolutely fascinating. Also, the fact that everything that in the Biden-Harris administration, when they have economic struggles, it's COVID's fault. Even in 2024, it's still COVID's fault. But when you have anything that, any struggles that Donald Trump had, they have amnesia about COVID. I think it's very interesting. But anyway, Mr. Winfree, overregulation has been the silent killer of economic growth under the Biden-Harris administration, imposing roughly $1.7 trillion in regulatory costs on businesses and households in the last 4 years. To rein in these egregious levels of red tape, we introduced the REG, the Budgeting Act, to establish a regulatory spending cap for each federal agency to incentivize agencies to reduce these burdens and rescind outdated regulations before they institute new ones. This action alone could save hundreds of billions of dollars or more in necessary costs, as we saw during the Trump administration, which achieved a net reduction in unnecessarily regulatory costs. How might a proposal such as this benefit businesses and consumers?
I think that it would benefit businesses and consumers and American households tremendously. I mean, just getting the administration to think about the trade-offs of their regulation is a helpful exercise. And it's not something that we have experimented with unilaterally in the United States as we did in the Trump administration in 2017. It's something that is a typical procedure that's used in the United Kingdom and also in Canada and in other of our peer nations.
Ms. Onwuka, regulatory burdens have been implemented by the Biden-Harris administration's green climate agenda on household appliances like stoves and dishwashers and water heaters. How will these changes affect Americans, and more specifically, low-income Americans?
Well, these new regulations, these requirements, I mean, number one, they're cost prohibitive for the upfront cost for spending on these, these new appliances, the upfront cost of installing these new things, and it's, as I said, it's cost prohibitive to many households, particularly those who are low income. As I stated earlier in my testimony, low income families spend disproportionately more of their budgets on basic necessities. Where is the extra money the extra $9,000 to retrofit their households with these new appliances? It seems honestly very elitist to put these mandates on so many households, and frankly, it dismisses the real hardship that they're experiencing.
Thank you. Mr. Duke, what I presume you would agree, or you would assert that the economy's done better under the Biden-Harris administration than the Trump administration. Would that be your argument? You got to press your button, sorry.
When Donald Trump left office, the unemployment rate was about 7%. So,
what happened when he left office? Did we have a struggle going on at the time?
yeah, we had COVID.
Was it a global pandemic? Okay,
Yep,
let's
as
talk
was
about
inflation. Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the 3 years prior when he was president of the United States. He had administration 3 years, no COVID. What was the unemployment rate then?
In the threes?
Yeah, it was 3.5%, which is the lowest unemployment rate since 1969. And for African Americans, it was 5.6%, Hispanics 4.1%, which is literally the lowest in history. Do you know what the debt to GDP ratio was in 2019?
Lower than it is now?
A lot lower. It was 100% debt to GDP. Now it's 124%. And do you know what the inflation rate was at the time?
It was...
What's the inflation rate now? You just said it was 2.3%?
Yeah.
It was 1.8% then. So when you take out COVID, clearly the Biden-Harris administration didn't perform.
Yeah, the
nearly as
Biden-Harris
well
administration has been
as
cleaning up the mess that the Trump administration left them.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
I didn't ask you a question. I was making a final statement. Okay. Clearly, the economy was way better off when you take out COVID under the Trump administration than Biden-Harris. Every single economic indicator proves that. Chair now recognizes our friend Ms. Brown from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And you asked if we were all better off 4 years ago, and here's the facts. 4 years ago this week, there were over 750,000 new COVID cases. People were being hospitalized in tents and on ships because hospital buildings did not have the capacity to house the hundreds and thousands of patients. 4 years ago today, this week, 20,000 people died from COVID-19, adding to the already 500,000 deaths in the U.S. alone. Now, this is because of the pandemic that people were dying, and they were dying alone. Their bodies being stored in refrigerator trucks because morgues, mortuaries, and funeral homes could not house them. People were dying by the thousands, and Trump did what he always does. He lied. He tried to deceive the public by denying that the COVID-19 virus even existed. And after hundreds and thousands of people continued to die, he told them that it would be like the flu. It's going to be like the flu and it'll just go away. But when that didn't happen, he started to then suggest that we ingest bleach to deal with the COVID-19 virus that was killing thousands of people, that shut down the world, that closed people sheltering in place in their homes and closed businesses. That's what that administration did when the pandemic struck in the United States and all over the globe. So when my colleagues on the other side of the aisle spend their time chasing baseless accusations and providing no solutions to the American people, I just get a little frustrated. Because Democrats, when we had the majority in the 117th Congress, we took decisive action, passing landmark bills like the American Rescue Plan that put shots in arms, that helped people keep their businesses open, that really helped kept people from losing their homes and paid their bills. The PACT Act, which helped veterans who put their lives on the line so that people like me can enjoy the freedoms that far too many of us take for granted, would get the benefits that they deserve. And it doesn't end there. Thanks to the leadership of Speaker Pelosi, President Biden, and Vice President Harris, we passed the Inflation Reduction Act, the largest investment in our climate in human history. We passed the CHIPS and Science Act, investing tens of billions of dollars in technology, which has yielded more investment from private companies that is helping to develop everything from chips to cars to computers to all of the things that we use every day that were on backlog because of the pandemic under the Trump administration. We passed the Biden bipartisan infrastructure bill, the largest investment in our roads, railway, and bridges, where communities like mine have been struggling with disinvestment for decades. And because of these big, bold policies like these, our economy is now the envy of the world. Inflation is coming down. Our unemployment rate is historically low. Even the stock market is at record highs. President Biden and Vice President Harris has brought 800,000 manufacturing jobs back to the American people. Thanks to the IRA, Medicare was able to negotiate prescription drug costs for the first time, lowering costs for our seniors and people with disabilities. And thanks to the CHIPS and Science Act, America is now on track to manufacture 30% of the world's semiconductor chips. Just a few years ago, under Trump, how many were we supplying? 0. So, Mr. Duke, can you tell us, how would you characterize the state of the American economy right now?
We went through the toughest thing an economy can go through, a body blow, and we've built back better in a lot of ways. The employment rate is higher than it's ever been in terms of when you adjust for aging. Wealth has gone up 50% compared to inflation, which has gone up 22%. Wages are higher, they've gone up faster than inflation, and they've gone up faster than inflation for the lowest wage workers. And so we've got this remarkable recovery going, and it's just really important that we keep it going with the investments that the Biden-Harris administration has made, which are lowering costs while creating jobs.
And can you just tell me, former president has proposed massive tariffs on all sorts of goods, everything, tariff everything. What would be the economic consequences of this Project 2025 Trump plan to raise costs on American families?
Sure, Wall Street analysts think it'll put inflation back in the 3s or 4s. It's low 2s right now, back in the 3s or 4s. Cost a typical family $4,000, $6,000, way more than anything they got in tax cuts from Donald Trump. It's a Trump sales tax.
Thank you. There are two very different visions of America here. One where we boost, bolster, and invest in the middle class, lower health costs, and build an economy made to succeed in the 21st century. The other side has no plans for a brighter future. Their only economic concept of a plan are tax cuts for billionaires and largest business while raising taxes on the middle class Americans by an average of $3,900 a year. I know I speak for so many of my constituents that we cannot afford another Trump tax increase. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Chair now recognizes our good friend from South Carolina, Mr. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm perplexed a little bit because I think the title of this hearing is about kitchen table issues and economics, and all I've heard really is kind of like the typical Project 2025 boogeyman that keeps coming out. I got to hand it to him. I think North Korea would be proud of the level of propaganda on the other side. But we're here to talk about kitchen table issues, so let's talk about that. So the Census Bureau in Kamala Harris's home state of California, it's the #1 state of people moving out in 2024. They have a net migration of negative 10,453. Meanwhile, in my home state of South Carolina, we're number 2 in actual growth. And we welcome them. It's a good environment, it's good weather, good beaches. Mr. DeVore, do you believe it's a result of the high cost of living and regulatory burdens inflicted on Californians by the progressive state government there that people are leaving? Is that the main culprit?
Yes. If you look at history with California, you go back to, let's say, 1960, the cost of living relative to the rest of the country was about 105 to 110%. So, roughly 5 to 10% higher as an index if the rest of the country averages out to 100. Today, it's between 145 to 150, meaning it's about 45% more costly to live in California than in the average of the U.S. A huge part of that is a regulatory burden. I mentioned, for example, the cost of electricity. When I was in the legislature, we went from 8th most expensive in the country, and now California is number 2, only behind Hawaii, which derives its electricity from diesel generators and a little bit of solar. And that's pretty fantastic when you think about it. This huge state with all these abundant natural resources now has the 2nd most costly electricity prices in the nation, and that's pretty important when you look at the push to electrify our economy, not just the transportation sector, but everything.
How will it affect the cost of living for Americans on a national level if we take the California model and apply it to Washington?
It's pretty staggering. So if you look at the study that was commissioned when I was in the legislature, looking at, for example, the compliance costs for small business in California, just for the California regulatory burden, in inflation-adjusted terms today, it came out to about $200,000 per small business. That was several times, by the way, what the federal regulatory burden was at the time. Now, the Biden-Harris administration put in regulatory policies just in the last 3.5 years that more than equaled the entire federal regulatory burden as it existed about 20 years ago. And so what's happening with these federal regulations is that by pushing California and New York-like regulations down on the rest of the country, what you're doing is you're erasing the interstate advantages of low-tax, low-regulatory states like your South Carolina. You're making South Carolina more like California and New York when that happens, sir.
Exactly. Thank you. I want to switch to energy independence for a second. What are some of the ways in which the next administration should differ, hopefully, than the current one as it pertains to energy independence? Are there policies that on day one should be re-examined or repealed so that we're actually an energy leader in the world?
That's a great question. Of course, you need to open up federal lands again for exploration and for energy extraction. I don't know if it can be undone, but certainly the Keystone XL pipeline was something that would have been fantastic for North America. Fascinating to me, though, that the administration okayed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline at the same time it shut down a pipeline to bring Canadian, reliable, affordable Canadian energy into America. So those two things right off the bat. The other thing I think would be to rescind a lot of these unhelpful subsidies that were passed in the Inflation Reduction Act. What happens is that they're giving an incentive to unreliable, undispatchable power. And when you have power grids, as we've seen in California and as we've begun to see in Texas, that over-rely on wind and solar, what ends up happening is those power grids become unstable. You start to have planned blackouts or brownouts to manage your power supply. And lastly, you have to invest hugely in batteries to try to store the energy when it's being produced for when it's not available. The problem with battery energy, though, is it doesn't provide spinning reserve. Spinning reserve only can happen with large masses that allow for your electrical grid to be maintained at 60 hertz. Batteries can't do that. And so what happens is when your grid gets under strain because of a natural event like a snowstorm or a heat wave, or where it's not a windy day, your grid is going to be increasingly under threat to have rolling blackouts because batteries and wind and solar can't cut it. They don't have the reliability of thermal power like nuclear, coal, and natural gas.
Thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. O'Connor, our friend from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Winfree, as you've said to Representative Stansbury and many others, you authored the Federal Reserve chapter of Project 2025. Now, in 2016, you were on President Trump's transition team, correct?
That's right.
And do you have any role in his transition team now?
I do not.
In the Project 2025 Federal Reserve chapter, you recommend that we eliminate the dual mandate for the Fed. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And do you still recommend that if President Trump wins, he do that?
I would recommend that.
And to explain that,
It would actually require action from Congress.
but you would recommend that he pursue that policy. And to explain that, that basically means right now the Fed has a mandate to lower inflation and also to have full employment. You think that what the Fed should do is just focus on lowering inflation. In other words, would you recommend then that Chairman Powell should be raising interest rates until inflation comes to 2%?
I don't have any insight into the
But
data
would it-
that the Federal
but
Reserve
if you were to
has
eliminate
they're
the-
using to make their decision.
If you were to eliminate the dual mandate,
Correct.
Do you have a view of what the inflation target should be?
So I think it should be about 2%,
And so wouldn't the...
as it has been historically.
Wouldn't the natural course be that the Fed would have to raise interest rates until they hit the 2% mandate if that's the policy and if they aren't considering employment?
That's correct, but let's take a step back. The Federal Reserve has a dual mandate. Other large central banks like the European Central Bank and the Bank of England do not. They have a single mandate, price stability.
Sure, but under
right?
your
Because
proposal,
because
which
it's something they can actually control.
I just want to be clear. What you're saying is a future Trump presidency, if he took your recommendations, would mean higher interest rates. I mean, you would have the Fed under an elimination of the dual mandate, basically raising rates. Meaning, if I could finish, meaning that the stock market is going to go down with the rates being raised, meaning that we're going to have a problem with unemployment if the rates keep going up, because you're basically saying that the Fed has to be singularly focused on 2%. Am I misinterpreting what you're saying?
The Federal Reserve is an independent central bank, right, that has a mandate, a dual mandate from Congress. Congress would have to change that.
But
the president has...
The whole point is you want it changed. You want it changed, and you want Trump to change it. You were on the transition team. You've written a whole paper on it. I don't understand.
Yeah,
it's a defensible position. I mean, I think Milton Friedman, others would want it, but the American people should know the consequences. I mean, what you're advocating is Volcker-like policies, but at a time where we have 2.8% or 2.3% inflation. And what under your proposal, and if Trump comes in and listens to you, what that would mean is higher interest rates for the American people until we got to 2% interest, right? Isn't that correct?
And what happened after Volcker was the Fed chair? We had
I
massive economic growth.
think Volcker did a great job at the time, but that
Exactly.
was at 13%. But what you're saying is we got to swallow that medicine today, and you want higher interest rates in a Trump administration. Now, Mr. DeVore, thank you for your service. You know, they say it's statistics, lies, damn lies, and statistics, but I'm going to throw out two of them because you have so many statistics. Do you happen to know the GDP of California compared to Texas?
Well, of course, California is 60% larger, so the GDP is going to be larger than
Do you
Texas,
happen to know the per capita GDP difference?
It's also higher because of the area that you represent, sir, Silicon Valley. Absolutely. Chips are more expensive than oil.
Do you happen to know the real wage differential between California and Texas?
And it's marginally higher in California, although your Gini coefficient is higher than in Texas. So you have greater wage inequality in California than in Texas because we manufacture more than California does.
We could, it's 75,000 to 62,000, but why not just say they're two great states that help contribute to America's economic growth?
That's right. 1 in 4 Americans come from those two great states, sir.
Thank you.
Chair now recognizes our friend from here in the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As President, Mr. Trump failed to deliver on promises he made during his first term, leaving us with an economy in shambles. Even before the pandemic, he failed to grow the economy by 4% each year like he promised. He came into office saying he would pay off the national debt, but it surged under his watch long before the pandemic. Mr. Duke, Were Mr. Trump's economic promises those of a business genius?
I think, as you laid out, he failed to live up to them. I think a key thing is that over half of the increase in the national debt since 2000 has come from continuing the Bush tax cuts and continuing the Trump tax cuts. So he directly contributed to that. And apparently, just this week, he mentioned paying off the debt with crypto somehow. So, I mean, again, he's making even more outlandish promises than last time even.
Well, the policies being proposed by the former president are inflationary and would cost everyday Americans thousands of dollars each year. He has promised to pay for his proposals by imposing steep tariffs on all imported goods. So, Mr. Duke, how much would Mr. Trump's tariffs cost the typical American family?
According to my estimates, $3,900 each year, and then $3,900 the next year, and then $3,900 the next year. The Tax Foundation, a conservative think tank, found $6,000. The American Action Forum, another conservative think tank, also found $3,900. So I think people across the political spectrum agree that it is a huge real cost that families are going to have to pay if Donald Trump becomes president, and he can do it unilaterally without you guys agreeing to it, as he stated this week.
I'd like to talk now about one of the majority's witnesses, Paul Winfree. Mr. Winfree was the director of budget policy in the Trump White House. He also authored the Project 2025 chapter of the Federal Reserve. Earlier this year, Mr. Winfree said of Trump's tariff plan, quote, ultimately, that would not help the population that he is trying to help. It would raise prices and ultimately people would be worse off, end quote. Mr. Duke, do you agree with Mr. Winfree that Trump's tariff proposal would raise prices and leave people worse off?
Wholeheartedly.
The former president wants to make his 2017 massive tax giveaway for the wealthiest Americans, the largest corporations and largest corporations, permanent. We already know that Trump's tax law caused the national debt to surge even before the pandemic. Making it permanent would add another $4 trillion with a T dollars to the deficit, leading us on the path to more debt. And while Mr. Trump's tax law helps his wealthy friends, it is paid for on the backs of the middle class. Mr. Duke, is Mr. Trump's tax plan looking out for everyday Americans?
No, the combination of extending his tax law and then enacting these giant 10 to 20% taxes on every imported good would leave the vast majority of Americans worse off. This
summer, 16 Nobel Prize-winning economists signed onto a letter warning that the former president's policies would increase inflation and have a, and here I'm quoting, destabilizing effect, end quote, on the U.S. economy. I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record that letter that I'm passing now, and I yield back.
Without objection, so ordered. Chair now recognizes our friend from New Mexico, Ms. Stansberry, for a closing statement.
All All right, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've heard a lot of what I'll call fun facts this morning, which are things that are actually not fact at all, but statements that are intended to advance political reality that just is not true. And I do want to clear up a couple of these fun facts again. There was some talk this morning about the electric grid, its resilience, and the Inflation Reduction Act, and how the IRA is going to destroy our grid. Well, I invite any of my colleagues who made similar comments today to meet with your hometown utilities, because I have utilities come visit me every day who are eager to access these resources because our grid in many places is decades old. It needs modernization. It needs resilience backups. And part of why, unfortunately, in Texas, our neighbor state, there was such a catastrophic failure a few years ago is because the grid was not resilient, and that is what the IRA is all about. I also want to talk about the causes of inflation. There's been a lot of assertions here that are not founded in modern economics. The causes of inflation are very clearly tied to the economic disruptions that happened during the pandemic. We had supply chain issues, we had labor disruptions, there was war in Europe and the Middle East now. We have foreign actors that were engaged in price fixing like OPEC, and we know that American oil and gas companies, which are currently under investigation, have also been engaging in these activities, and we have price gouging by American companies that have been taking advantage of these disruptions to our economy to try to extract more money out of our working families. So, my colleagues made some comments this morning about the boogeyman of Project 2025. I want to just say Project 2025 is a boogeyman. Read it. You will see the policies that are being espoused in that document are extreme. If you haven't read it yet, I highly encourage you to do so. And the other boogeyman is the gentleman that hopes to take the ideas that have been put there by the former Trump administration officials and others who helped contribute it, who says that he wants to be a dictator on day one. He's already told us this. These policies are extreme. They would undermine women's rights. They would undermine LGBTQ rights. They would regulate morality. They would undermine banking regulations. They would undermine basic protections for working families all across the country. So the reason why we are focused on this issue and its relevance to this committee is that we have a gentleman here who is actually a chapter author of the bill. So we're discussing the actual content of the ideas that were brought before the committee, but also because we're here to talk about what's going on with the economy and what policies are going to advance the American people. I think it's very clear when you look at the data and you talk to Americans, and we look at our own individual ways in which the last several years have improved just our general quality of life. The Biden-Harris administration helped to save our economy from free fall with the American Recovery Plan. They put into place a vision that is rebuilding the American economy over the next several decades, that is building infrastructure all across this country, that's creating millions of jobs, that's making made in America manufacturing back in America, that's securing our national security, and that is helping veterans, low-income families, tribal communities, people of color, families. It is an agenda that is lifting up Americans. So I appreciate the focus on these issues today. Kitchen table economics are important to all of us. And with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Going into this hearing, I don't think any American would be surprised that Republicans would say that the economy is not as good as it should be or could be, and it's in fact bad, where Democrats were going to come up to the dais and say how awesome things were and how great everything is, and there's rainbows and unicorns and leprechauns throwing out gold coins. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at the Democrats, and they had a majority in the first 2 years that I had served in Congress from 2021 to 2023, they had unified government. They're going to claim they did magnificent things through massive government spending because, as they will claim, it cures all ills. And then we have some things, statistics, and you have to be wary of people that want to cook the books. And for instance, the minority witness said that wages have increased by 27% and inflation has only gone up 20%. So what's the problem? But the devil's in the details, because overall, he was talking about overall payroll, because there's more people on the payroll. There's more people employed. The employment pool itself has expanded. He wasn't talking about per capita. Very, very important distinction. And then we have some of our friends on the other side of the aisle blame President Trump because, when COVID hit America in 2020, all the deaths were his fault because he wanted people to swallow bleach, which is another one of those lies. But fact of the matter is, and then they said, because we put shots in people's arms, was the quote. Well, who's responsible for Operation Warp Speed? It was President Donald Trump. He was the one that said, we're going to get this vaccine and we're going to essentially warp speed it. And he was mocked. He was ridiculed. You can't possibly get a vaccine that works that quickly. And yet they did. And in 2020, undeniable fact, unfortunately, we lost 350,831 Americans to COVID. In 2022, we lost over 460,000 Americans to COVID. More people died of COVID in 2021 under Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, but the right doesn't blame them for the deaths because it was the virus that killed those people. So it was propaganda and more drivel. And any economic struggle under the Biden-Harris administration is due to COVID. Even in 2024, they're still saying we're recovering from it. But any dark clouds that President Trump had in 2020, they just have amnesia about COVID at all. And certainly want to forget, as I mentioned earlier, how well the economy was doing in the first 3 years of the Trump administration. The debt-to-GDP ratio was significantly lower, unemployment was at all-time lows across every demographic you can mention, and inflation was only at 1.8%. Now, here's another important distinction because these are these pesky facts. According to the Census Bureau, not fun fact, yeah. Real median income, household income in 2019 was $68,703. Inflation went up 21.8% from that point to today, or to 2023 rather. In 2023, that would have meant that if real household median income kept pace with inflation, that would be $83,543. But in point of fact, it is now $80,610, which is $2,933 less than it should be, almost 4% less in real wages. That's just an inconvenient truth that our friends on the other side of the aisle don't want to discuss. That's $3,000 less. And to a family making that, a household, that's a big deal. So this is the question that I really would encourage every American to ask themselves. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? When you look at the economy, if you just look at economics and you ask the American people, who can handle the economy better? Kamala Harris, a person that's never signed the front of one paycheck, or a successful businessman, Donald Trump. According to the New York Times, a recent poll, Trump wins that argument 54-41. CNBC 40-21, and NBC 50-41. Now, these are not, by any measure, conservative outlets. So if you had just that issue, President Trump would win in a landslide. That's why you hear our friends across the aisle talking about everything else but the economy when they're out in the campaign trail. Abortion, Project 2025. The Russia hoax, and then they will misquote, as Kamala Harris did in the debate, saying, he said that if he doesn't win, there's going to be a bloodbath. He was referring to the auto industry and how they would have an economic bloodbath. That's just intellectually dishonest. And if the right did that, I would be upset as well, because that's taking things completely out of context. And then we heard it twice up here about bleach. You wanted people to swallow bleach. I think every 6-year-old knows you swallow bleach, it's not going to be a good outcome. Again, twisting words. Dictator on day one, all that kind of stuff. And that's why they don't want you to talk and think about the kitchen table economics, because it doesn't bode well for them. It will be a landslide if this election is decided on that front. You talk about California and Texas, our two biggest states.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to remind you that we're on official property. This is not a campaign.
I'm not campaigning at all. I am talking about.
We shouldn't be
I'm talking about
campaigns here in this setting. Thank you.
I'm talking about what people. I want every American. I didn't tell anybody American to vote one way or the other. I want them all to participate. I want them to participate in the election. I want their voices to be heard. This is a representative republic. And when you want to compare California to Texas, people do vote with their feet. California's got this
Mr.
weather
Chairman, I want to
and
remind
topography.
you that we are on government property, and using government property for electoral politics
This
is
is ridiculous.
not appropriate.
I'm not talking about anything. I'm talking about California and Texas. There is a state called California. It's in the Pacific. It's just south of Oregon. It's just west of Nevada. Lots of people live there. In fact, they have beautiful, I've been there. They have beautiful weather and topography, and yet they're bleeding jobs, prosperity, and opportunity. Fact, they lost an electoral vote for the first time in their history. That's a fact. Texas gained 2 electoral votes. And I don't think people moved to Texas for our majestic mountain vistas. I don't think people moved to Texas for our world-class beaches or our refreshingly cool August afternoons. I think they moved there because of the promise of opportunity and prosperity and liberty and promise and hope. So I think the American people, come the next 6 weeks, and I hope you would agree, you'd want everybody that's American citizen over the age of 18 years old to participate in our election cycle, in our representative republic. And if they focus on kitchen table economics, I think it will be a decisive landslide for one of the candidates. And in closing, I want to thank our witnesses again for your testimony today. Thank you. With that, and without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit materials and to submit additional written questions for the witnesses, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. If there is no further business without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.